Hi, the purpose of this video is to show you how to implement single sign-on in Salesforce. Before we actually get into the implementation, I'd like to take a couple of minutes to go through some of the basics of single sign-on and the components involved in a single sign-on deployment. So single sign-on is a process that allows the user to access multiple applications or systems after going through the authentication process only once. So Salesforce provides a couple of different ways to implement single sign-on: delegated authentication and federated authentication. Delegated authentication is a proprietary Salesforce solution that captures the user login credentials and sends it over to an external web service for authentication. Now, the external web service has to be developed, built, and deployed by the client. A couple of drawbacks to this option are that it's not as secure. When the web service is down, user will not be allowed to log in, and it can only be configured at a profile level within Salesforce. The second option, which is the federated authentication, is a more widely accepted single sign-on solution because it is based on an industry standard called SAML. Now, SAML is nothing but security assertion markup language. It is based in an XML format, and it is the industry standard for federated SSO deployments. It's used by federation partners to share identity attributes of the user. There are two versions of SAML available: SAML 1.1 and SAML 2.0. Salesforce only supports SAML 2.0 because that's the latest version. In the SAML scenario, there are a couple of actors involved. The first is the identity provider, and the second is the service provider. Identity provider is the system that is providing the SAML assertion, which contains the user's identity, and that's passed over to the service provider. The service provider is the system that is consuming the assertion that is passed in from the identity provider. It uses the assertion to gather the user attributes, and based on that information, it allows the user to log in to the requested resource server. For the purposes of our implementation, we're going to use two Salesforce orgs. We're going to set up the first org as an identity provider and the second org as a service provider. So we're going to test a couple of scenarios. When a user logs into the first identity provider org, they should be able to click a link which takes them to the second service provider org without having to log in once again. And with single sign-on, there are a couple of different flows, and we can test both these flows. The first flow is the identity provider initiated flow. So with this flow, the user logs into the identity provider, and after logging in, tries to access the service provider. When that is done, the identity provider sends over a SAML assertion to Salesforce. And the SAML assertion has details like the federation ID or the Salesforce email or Salesforce username. The second flow is the service provider initiated flow. In this flow, the user tries to access the service provider directly without logging in to the identity provider first. So an example of this is when a user tries to access an email or a bookmark or a deep link. And when the service provider finds that the user's identity has not been established yet, it routes the user to the identity provider. The user will then have to log in to the identity provider, and the identity provider is going to send a SAML assertion along with the relay state to the identity provider. I'm sorry, to the service provider, and the user will be logged in to the service provider. So let's go ahead and get going with the implementation. I have two Salesforce orgs. The Salesforce org that I have opened up in my Chrome browser is my identity provider. I'm sorry, my service provider, and the Salesforce org I have opened up in my Firefox is the identity provider. So let's set up the identity provider org first. So I'm going to go into setup, and under setup I'm going to first enable a feature called my domain. So under administer domain management, you'll see the my domain option. I'm going to click on that, and as you can see, for this org I already have my domain enabled. The reason I mean, I cannot undo this, so once it's set up, there's no going back. But my domain is pretty easy to set up. You would choose a domain name, register the domain. You have to make sure that the domain is available because every domain is unique. And once it's registered, you'll be able to test and deploy to users. So after that, the URL, as you can see here, changes to the domain name that I provided, which is kk-identity provider. And it's really a feature that lets a business have its own unique domain URL. So once the my domain feature is enabled, I'm going to go into the identity provider option, which can be found under administer security controls, and I should be able to set up my identity provider now since my domain is enabled. So the first thing here is you want to enable this org to serve as an identity provider. So I'm going to go ahead and click this button. Once I do that, it's going to ask me what certificate I want to use when I communicate with my service provider. I have a self-signed certificate that I'm going to use. In case you're wondering how certificates are generated, there is a option under security controls called certificate and key management. And here you'll see a couple of different options where you can create a self-signed certificate, which is what I've done, or you'll be able to create a CA signed certificate. So this option is really you're generating a CSR first, which is a certificate signing request, which then needs to be signed by a CA authority like VeriSign or TOT. Right, going back to the identity provider setup, I'm going to select the certificate and hit save. So now my identity provider is configured and I see a issuer URL that is generated. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this and put it into my Word doc because we're going to use this when we set up our service provider. Now the next step is to create a connected app for the service provider. So the connected app is really saying that there is an external app which is going to be connecting to this Salesforce org. So I'm going to click this link here, which is going to bring me to the new connected app screen. So I'm going to give my connected app a unique name. I'm going to say Salesforce service provider and provide an email. And we're going to set up a logo. I'm sorry, an icon and a logo image for this connected app. I'm just going to choose one of the standard icons since it's a Salesforce org. So doing that, I can copy this logo URL, paste it here, copy the icon URL. And when you scroll down, you can see an option to enable SAML, and this is important. Once you enable SAML, it presents a bunch of fields that need to be configured. The first one is the entity ID, and since the service provider is Salesforce, for Salesforce the entity ID is always saml.salesforce.com. Now the ACS URL is the assertion consumer service. We will get this information when we set up our service provider. So for now, I'm just gonna say google.com. We'll come back and change this later. Now the SAML assertion under the subject type can contain any of the following user attributes. It could either have the username, the Salesforce user ID, or the federation ID. I'm going to go ahead and select federation ID because that's the the best practice and the most widely used subject type. I'm going to change the name ID format to SAML 2.0. The issuer field is pre-populated for this identity provider. The next two options are really asking if you want to verify the request signature. So if the service provider is sending a SAML request, which is signed with a certificate, you can enable this option. And the SAML response can be encrypted as well. For now, I'm just going to leave that as is and hit save. So now that I'm done with that, I'm gonna hit manage, and this should show me the IDP login URL, which is of interest to us. So I'm gonna go ahead and copy this because we're gonna need this for the service provider configuration. All right. So let's go ahead and make sure our user has permissions for this connected app. So I'm going to hit on manage profiles and make sure the system administrator profile can access this connected app. So let's move over to the service provider org and configure the service provider. So with this Salesforce org, I'm going to go to setup, and I'm going to search for single sign-on settings, which can be found under security controls. So I'm going to go to single sign-on settings, and I'm going to enable SAML for this org. I'm going to hit save, and then I'm going to create a single sign-on setting for the new identity provider that we created in the IDP org. So I'm going to give it a name. The issuer was generated in the IDP, which we copied over, so I'm going to go ahead and put that in. The entity ID, again, this is a Salesforce service provider, so it's always going to be saml.salesforce.com. So let's go ahead and do that. Right, so the identity provider certificate was generated when we configured the IDP. So let's go ahead and download that certificate. So when I go to identity provider in my IDP org, I should have an option to download the certificate. So I'm going to go ahead and save this certificate, go back to my service provider, and choose that file. So I'm going to go ahead and upload the certificate. Now, moving down to the SAML identity type, you can specify what the assertion is going to contain. And since we selected Federation ID, let's make sure we select that for the service provider as well. The identity of the SAML identity could either be in the name identifier field of the subject XML tag, or it could be a custom attribute tag. So I'm going to leave it under the subject tag. Now the identity provider login URL, we copied that onto our Word doc here, so let me grab that and paste that here, and then hit save. And yeah, that's our IDP setting for our service provider. And once that is done, you'll see that a Salesforce login URL was generated, and this is nothing but the ACS URL. So I'm going to copy this and go back to my identity provider. Let's go back to connected app, and you notice how it says google.com here, which we said would come back and fix. So let's go back and change the ACS URL. So I'm going to paste that over and hit save. And so now we've set up our identity provider and service provider. So let's go ahead and make sure the federation ID is set up in the user account that we're using. So I'm going to go to my settings, go to personal, advanced user details, and under the user record there should be a field called federation ID. And I've already populated this field with my username. And let's make sure this is also set up in the service provider because it has to match. So if I go into my settings and advanced user details, as you can see, it's already been set up and it matches. So we're good there. So let's go ahead and test our first scenario, which is I'm trying to access my service provider after logging into my identity provider. So I'm in Firefox. This is the IDP org. Let me go ahead and switch my app to App Launcher. And then as you can see, the connected app that we created does not show up here because I don't think we specified a start URL. So let me, in the connected app, hit edit and specify a start URL. So this is the URL that the service provider's, the identity provider is going to take you to when you click the service provider icon. So I'm going to let's default the start URL to the accounts tab in the service provider. So I'm going to copy that URL and paste it into my service provider app. All right. Now if I go here and refresh, it should show me the service provider. There you go. Now again, this scenario is when I've logged into my identity provider and I'm trying to access my service provider. So when I click here, you'll notice that the URL will be different. So as you can see, it says this is my service provider and it defaulted to the accounts tab. So that's the first test case and that was successful. Now the second scenario is when I'm trying to do the service provider initiated flow, which is I'm going to go into my service provider org and I'm going to log out. So now I'm trying to access my service provider org for the first time without logging in. So this should redirect me to the identity provider. So I'm going to hit enter and okay, it did not. So the reason being, I don't think we set up the authentication option correctly. So I'm going to directly log back into my service provider. So now if I go into setup and go back to the my domain, option. Here you'll see an authentication configuration option, so I'm going to edit that, and I'm going to select the identity provider option. So what I'm doing here is I'm telling Salesforce that a user will be able to log into this org either through the standard Salesforce login page or through the identity provider single sign-on. So I'm going to hit save. I'm just going to move to my accounts tab. I'm going to copy this URL, right, and then I'm going to log out of this org. So I'm logged out of my service provider org, and let me try to access that deep link to the accounts tab that I copied. So I'm going to hit enter, and then as you can see, now it shows me an option to say, hey, log in using identity provider. So I'm going to hit that, and it's going to redirect to the identity provider page and then back to my service provider. So that's the second scenario, which is the service provider initiated flow. As you can see, we covered both the test cases. So that's how you set up single sign-on in Salesforce as both the IDP and service provider. I hope this video was helpful, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.